Unlike those who were attracted to the mock crucifixions and fire and brimstone rhetoric, Tex Watson had little use for the religious tone of Manson's talk. Growing up in rural Texas, he was taught that good Christians didn't call attention to themselves. They sat in a pew and conducted themselves with modesty and decorum. In fact, he'd been told that holy rollers, those who gave in to the more ecstatic experience of Christ's love, were bad Christians. When he moved to LA, Watson was also exposed to Scientology. But Tex was too busy living life and dealing drugs to think about bettering himself spiritually. He never bought into the whole helter-skelter story either. The man who would later be called Manson's right-hand man was anything but. 3 of the male family members instrumental in the murders of that summer, Tex, Bobby Beausoleil, and Bruce Davis, were never more than fringe members of the family. They were associates at best. Charlie considered them important, but neither Bobby nor Tex ever showed much in the way of loyalty to Manson until they started slaughtering people. Tex was gone for 3 months that winter, and in that time grew greedy and unscrupulous with his small-scale drug operation. These exploits continued when he returned to Spahn Ranch. On April 13th, Watson is alleged to have robbed Joel Rostau, a drug dealer. Rostau, who worked for a Boston-based mob guy named Eugene Gino Massaro, was dating Charlene McCaffrey, the receptionist at Sebring International, the company owned by Jay Sebring. This is one connection between killers and victims that bears investigating. Rostau was an intermediary in Massaro's LA drug ring in the late 60s. The police had a large file on his activities. Joel was later found murdered in the trunk of a car parked at Kennedy Airport in May 1970. Many people believe that he is an important, maybe even key piece of the Tate-LaBianca puzzle. Rostau and Massaro were reputed to use a vending company as a front for their business. In Charles Tex Watson's own words, "I'd arranged to buy a kilo of grass from the dealer who'd been supplying the family. He fronted the dope with a vending machine company, and people said he was with the mafia." His statement seems to implicate Rostau and Massaro. Reports were that by that summer, Jay Sebring was snorting cocaine daily. In fact, he purchased a gram of coke hours before his death. It was found by police in the hairstylist's sports car the day after he was murdered. Rostau claimed that 2 armed men came into his home on April 13th and tied Charlene and him up with rope. This was the same modus operandi that Tex used at Cielo Drive 4 months later. In fact, author Nicholas Schreck claimed that Watson used the same gun at both crimes. The robbers beat Rostau and demanded he give them his drugs. The taller of the 2 intruders, both with southern accents, shot Rostau in the foot as they fled. Schreck stated that the other robber was Bruce Davis, yet Davis was still in London on April 13th. But who else do we know who was shorter than Tex and spoke with a southern or twangy accent? Perhaps Manson himself. A neighbor heard the gunshot and called police, who arrived to find Rostau and McCaffrey tied up. After they released the pair, the cops discovered narcotics on the scene. So Rostau and Charlene were arrested for possession. Marijuana, hash, and cocaine were found, which begs the question of whether the robbers actually made off with any drugs, or perhaps Rostau only gave them some of what he had. Either that or the burglars were particularly inept. That, too, sounds like it could describe either Watson or Manson. Charlene was released on her own recognizance, but Joel was charged with possession of narcotics for sale, indicating a large amount, more than one person could consume. He was released on $5,000 bail, but was called in after Sebring, Tate, etc. were killed when Charlene told police about their link. I will return to this matter when covering the investigation at Cielo. On April 19th, the LAPD raided Spahn Ranch. This may have been an initial search for info on the stolen VW. Squeaky was the only person arrested. She spent 3 days in lockup on suspicion of grand theft auto, but was released when the DA claimed the police had insufficient evidence. It is clear, though, that the family were being watched by police. They knew it and grew paranoid. They began to make hiding places, special spots where even the man with his helicopters couldn't find them. They had a field telephone set up, so when the police came, there would be time to spread the word and hide in the woods. They hung little witchy things in the trees, ornaments made from wires and rocks and branches, to guide them as they moved in the dark. They had one place so remote, hidden between 2 freeways, it could only be reached by crawling through a sewer pipe. Squeaky wrote, Tex had labored to dig out a foundation in rocky ground and then built walls around the oddly shaped space. It was nice inside, big enough to hold all of us. We called it the in-case place, in case we needed extra space, in case we needed to lie low. On April 23rd, Tex was arrested for public intoxication. Days earlier, Paul Watkins spotted a Belladonna plant, the deadly nightshade, growing wild in the hills near Spahn Ranch. He'd been introduced to the plant while living on a Hopi Indian reservation and knew how to brew it into a narcotic drink. He made the mistake of sharing this information with Manson, who was pissed at some guy in Chatsworth who'd kicked him off his property. Charlie told Watkins that he wanted to get the man and asked the little Paul if he knew how to poison someone. Paul admitted yes, he did, and with Manson's encouragement, dug up some belladonna roots and brewed them into a gallon of tea. Nothing came of Paul's concoction, but a few days later Brenda made her own belladonna brew. According to a statement that Tex made later to Dr. Kenneth Bailey during his trial, a girl named Brenda cooked some belladonna roots that Paul found growing wild at Spahn's ranch. He pulled it up, she cooked it, and I walked into the kitchen en route to the motorcycle shop. Paul later testified that he watched Tex pick up a hunk of root, then announced that he was leaving to go find his motorcycle. He left chewing the root, which is highly poisonous if ingested raw. When asked when he saw Watson next, Paul said it was 3 days later and Tex's face was all banged up. Tex explained, I was crawling on my knees and my mouth was foaming cotton. My body was sort of red and I fell down 3 or 4 times and then I couldn't stand. The last thing I remember, the police were dragging me out of some car in the valley. I was in Van Nuys jail the next morning. He couldn't even sign his damn name when he was taken to the precinct. He was so out of it. That famous mugshot of Watson, the one of him grinning with scruffy hair and filthy teeth, wasn't taken in August when the family was arrested at Spahn Ranch. In fact, Tex was in Death Valley during that raid. His mugshot was taken April 23rd in the throes of his belladonna intoxication. He was hallucinating, unable to talk, and his cellmates had quite the time with him. 3 guys in the cell jumped me and beat me up. They said I was very strong. The police took me to the hospital to have my right eyebrow sewed up. He was released the next day, but left behind a powerful piece of evidence, his fingerprint. That print later placed Watson at the gate of Cielo Drive on August 9th. Tex wasn't himself after that bad trip. According to Sadie, he'd disappear for long periods of time or sit comatose for hours and have to be hand-fed. I remember it really messed him up. Lynette recalled, Mary, Ella, and Tex took acid before a trip to the city for supplies. When they returned, the girls looked haggard. Everything was fine, they said, until they were about to come home, and Tex began literally picking up children, saying he had to get them to the desert before sundown. The girls had to disengage him from a child and get him into the car. On April 25th, Bruce Davis flew back to the U.S. after his time at Scientology headquarters in London. he was booted from the organization for using drugs. Ella picked him up at the airport and drove him to Spahn Ranch, where the family celebrated his return. Bruce briefly flew to Louisiana at the end of April to collect a small family inheritance, but returned to Spahn less than 2 weeks later.